Perched high on the edge of a sheer cliff, where the wind howls and the waves crash hundreds of feet below, stands a fortress that seems to laugh in the face of gravity itself. How did medieval builders armed with little more than stone, muscle, and sheer determination manage to tame these wild landscapes and erect monuments that still take our breath away today? This is a story of human ambition clashing with the untamed forces of nature, a duel etched into the very rock beneath our feet. These cliffside fortresses weren't just buildings, they were declarations of defiance, proof that even the most unforgiving terrain could be conquered by creativity and grit. Picture the scene: a team of craftsmen, their hands calloused from years of labor, studying the cliff face like generals plotting a battle. Every crack in the rock, every shift in the wind, every angle of the sun had to be accounted for. One wrong move, and the entire structure could crumble into the sea below. Yet somehow, they pulled it off, creating fortresses that clung to the edges of the world, as if daring nature to try and shake them loose. What secrets did these architects know that allowed them to outwit erosion, storms, and even gravity itself? The answers lie in a blend of brilliant engineering, ruthless practicality, and a deep understanding of the land they sought to master. This isn't just a tale of stones and mortar, it's a saga of human resilience. These fortresses weren't built for glory alone. They were lifelines, protecting kingdoms from invaders and offering sanctuary in the most hostile environments imaginable. Every wall, every tower, every hidden passage tells a story of innovation under pressure. And the most astonishing part, many of these structures still stand today, silent witnesses to a time when humans looked at a vertical cliff and saw not an obstacle, but an opportunity. So let's step into their world, where every decision was a gamble against nature, and discover how medieval architects turned impossible odds into enduring legends. Building a fortress on the edge of a cliff might seem like madness until you realize it was pure genius. These towering strongholds didn't just dominate the landscape for dramatic effect, they turned nature itself into an ally. Imagine you're a medieval warlord staring down an advancing army. Would you rather defend a castle on open plains where enemies can surround you from all sides? Or would you choose a fortress where 3/4 of your perimeter is protected by a sheer drop into oblivion? That's the kind of advantage cliffside architects were after. The vertigo-inducing drops acted as natural moats, forcing attackers into narrow, easily defended approaches where a handful of archers could hold off hundreds. But defense wasn't the only perk. These lofty perches gave commanders something even more valuable: visibility. From their eagle's nest vantage points, sentries could spot enemy movements miles away, whether by land or sea, buying critical time to prepare. Take Mont Saint-Michel, rising like a stone sentinel from the tidal flats of Normandy. At high tide, the surrounding waters swallowed the land, transforming the fortress into an island. Attackers would have to wait for the tides to retreat, giving defenders days to regroup. Meanwhile, Gibraltar's sheer cliffs made it nearly unconquerable, a fact empires from the Moors to the British exploited for centuries. Yet the choice to build on cliffs wasn't just about survival, it was about power. A fortress clinging to the edge of the world sent a clear message: we don't just command this land, we defy it. These structures became symbols of unshakable authority, their silhouettes etched against the sky like royal crests. The castle of the Moors in Portugal didn't just overlook the land, it seemed to grow from the mountain itself, as if the earth had bowed to human will. And let's not forget the psychological edge. Nothing demoralized an invading force like staring up at walls that appeared to merge with the clouds, knowing every step forward could be their last. Of course, the land itself dictated the design. Architects didn't just plop a standard castle blueprint onto a cliff and call it a day. They adapted, using the rock's contours as foundations, weaving towers into crevices and carving staircases straight into the stone. The result, fortresses that felt less like buildings and more like extensions of the terrain, organic, inevitable, and utterly formidable. This wasn't just construction. It was a high-stakes negotiation with nature, where every decision balanced strength against the elements. And as we'll see, that negotiation never really ended. Nature didn't roll out the welcome mat for these ambitious builders. It threw everything it had at them. Imagine standing on a crumbling ledge, hammer in hand, with the ocean roaring below and the wind doing its best to knock you into oblivion. This wasn't just construction. It was a battle against the elements, where the first challenge was simply finding a way to anchor dreams to unstable rock. The cliffs themselves were deceptive. What looked solid from a distance often hid fractures, weak layers, or hidden water channels that could turn a promising foundation into rubble overnight. Landslides were a constant threat, especially after heavy rains, when the earth seemed to shrug off human interference like an irritated giant. And then there was the wind. Gale force gusts didn't just make work miserable, they could send scaffolding or workers plummeting into the abyss. Builders in places like Dunnottar Castle faced storms that howled up the chalk cliffs like living things, forcing them to devise ingenious solutions. They learned to time their work with the seasons, carving stone blocks during calmer months and securing them with wooden braces until mortar could set. Even then, erosion was a silent enemy, nibbling away at cliffs over decades, demanding structures be designed not just for the present, but for centuries of wear. Water posed its own nightmares. Salt spray from crashing waves seeped into mortar, weakening it over time, while rain found every crevice, freezing and expanding in winter to crack walls from within. Some builders countered this by mixing crushed seashells into their mortar, creating a tougher bond that resisted salt's bite. Others, like those at Dunnottar Castle in Scotland, positioned their fortresses just beyond the reach of the highest tides, letting the sea defend them without drowning their foundations. Yet perhaps the most daunting challenge was the sheer verticality of it all. Hauling stone blocks up narrow, winding paths, or worse, lifting them by pulley systems dangling over open air required not just muscle but nerve. A single snapped rope could mean disaster. The builders of Dunnottar Castle in Slovenia went even further, embedding their fortress into the mouth of a cave, where they had to contend with dripping limestone and unstable cavern floors. Every site demanded its own solutions, turning each cliffside fortress into a custom-made masterpiece of problem-solving. These struggles didn't just shape the buildings, they reshaped the builders. Medieval engineers became keen observers of geology, learning to read rock layers like pages in a survival manual. They discovered which stones could bear weight and which would crumble, where to reinforce and where to trust the land's natural strength. In the end, the very obstacles that seemed impossible forged a new kind of architecture, one that didn't fight nature, but danced with it, turning weaknesses into unbreakable defenses. And that hard-won wisdom would echo through the ages, etched into walls that still stand today. Faced with cliffs that seemed determined to shake off their creations, medieval architects responded with a blend of ingenuity and sheer stubbornness. Their first move, reinventing the very concept of foundations. Instead of fighting the irregular shapes of cliff faces, they embraced them, carving stepped platforms into the rock that created staggered levels of support. Think of it like building on a staircase, each step redistributing the fortress's weight deeper into stable stone, preventing concentrated pressure from cracking weak points. At places like the Castle of Laura in Spain, you can still see these terraced foundations gripping the mountainside, their uneven profiles blending seamlessly with the natural rock. But stepped foundations were just the beginning. Builders soon realized they needed reinforcements hidden beneath the surface. Enter the secret weapon of medieval engineering, the concealed buttress. Unlike the flying buttresses of cathedrals which flaunted their strength, these cliffside supports worked invisibly. Workers would tunnel into the cliff itself, creating hollow chambers filled with rubble and mortar that acted like internal anchors. The result, a fortress that wasn't just sitting on the cliff but fused with it, its weight dispersed through a web of man-made roots, the cliff-top fortress of St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall used this trick masterfully, its walls appearing to grow straight from the granite below, with no visible hint of the labyrinth of supports beneath. Then came the art of counterbalancing. On slopes where one side of a structure risked sliding into the void, architects added weight strategically, thicker walls on the downhill side, or towers positioned like bookends to pin the building in place. The Castle of Donan in Scotland took this further, its three interconnected buildings forming a tripod-like stability, ensuring that even if one section shifted, the others held firm. Perhaps the most daring innovation was the cantilever, a technique borrowed from shipbuilders. By extending floors and battlements beyond the foundation's edge, supported by massive wooden beams embedded deep in the rock, builders created the illusion of structures defying gravity. The cliffside monasteries of Meteora in Greece perfected this illusion, their wooden balconies hovering over 1,000-foot drops like divine afterthoughts. These weren't just technical solutions, they were acts of philosophy. Medieval builders understood that to conquer a cliff, you had to think like one. Their designs mimicked nature's own strategies, distributing stress like tree roots, bracing against forces like wind-sculpted stone. In doing so, they didn't just tame the landscape, they elevated architecture into a dialogue with the earth itself, one that still whispers to us from those weathered walls today. If you've ever tried stacking books on a steep slope, you know how quickly gravity wins. Now imagine doing that with 1,000-ton stone walls. Medieval architects faced this exact challenge, and their solution was as elegant as it was effective: terracing. Far from mere decorative steps, these layered platforms were engineering marvels that turned chaotic cliffs into structured strongholds. Picture a team of stonemasons, their chisels biting into the rock face, transforming what nature made vertical into something humans could actually use. Each terrace acted like a giant stepping stone, creating flat surfaces where none existed, while simultaneously anchoring the fortress deeper into the mountain's bones. The genius of terracing lay in its dual purpose. On the surface, it provided stable ground for towers and walls, but beneath, it worked like an invisible shield against the cliff's greatest threat: erosion. By breaking a single steep slope into multiple smaller steps, builders drastically reduced the speed of rainwater runoff. This prevented the violent scouring that could undercut foundations over time. At Carcassonne in France, the terraces weren't just functional, they became part of the fortress's visual drama, their staggered levels making the walls appear to rise organically from the hill itself. But holding back an entire mountainside required more than just flat surfaces. Hidden within each terrace was a secret weapon: the retaining wall. These weren't simple barriers, they were carefully engineered systems, often thicker at the base and tapered upward, designed to bear the immense pressure of the earth behind them. Builders packed the spaces between these walls with rubble and compacted soil, creating a shock-absorbing layer that could shift slightly without collapsing. The Sicilian fortress of Eris took this further, weaving its retaining walls into the natural fissures of the cliff, so the terrain and architecture became indistinguishable. Then there was the water problem. Without proper drainage, terraces would turn into soggy death traps during storms. Medieval engineers solved this by embedding channels and weep holes into every level, directing water away from critical areas. At Mont Saint-Michel in the Pyrenees, they carved gutters that funneled rainwater into cisterns, turning a potential hazard into a resource. These systems were so precise that many still function today, centuries after their creators vanished. What's truly remarkable is how these techniques varied by location. In the arid cliffs of Spain, terraces were wider to maximize shade and water retention, while in the storm-battered British Isles, they were steeper and reinforced with extra drainage. Each adaptation whispered a lesson about working with the land rather than against it. The terraces of Dunnottar Castle in Romania cling to the Carpathian cliffs like a spider's web, their irregular shapes mirroring the rock's natural fractures, proof that the best designs didn't conquer nature but conversed with it. This wasn't just construction, it was alchemy. Through terracing, medieval architects performed a kind of magic, transforming sheer drops into livable spaces and unstable slopes into enduring monuments. The next time you see a cliffside fortress, look closer. Those graceful steps are more than meets the eye. They're the silent triumph of human ingenuity over a landscape that said no at every turn. Some medieval builders didn't just cling to cliffs, they taunted them, constructing towers and chambers that hung over sheer drops like stone acrobats frozen mid-performance. These gravity-defying designs weren't just for show, they were high-stakes calculations where every block had to pull double duty, bearing weight while counterbalancing the void beneath. The secret lay in an ancient technique refined to perfection, cantilevering. Picture a wooden beam thrust deep into the fortress wall, its inner end anchored by tons of masonry, while the outer end stretched brazenly over empty space. This wasn't just architecture, it was architectural tightrope walking, where the margin for error was measured in inches. Take the legendary castle of Castel Sant'Angelo in Italy, where entire galleries seem to float above the Tiber River. Builders here employed a trick straight from nature's playbook, mimicking the way tree roots grip soil. They embedded massive oak beams soaked in tar to resist rot into the core of the walls, then stacked stone around them like a counterweight. The farther the beam reached outward, the deeper its opposite end dug into the fortress's heart, creating a seesaw of forces that locked the structure in place. One wrong calculation and the whole assembly would pivot into the abyss. But wood wasn't the only weapon in this battle against physics. In Wales' Conwy Castle, engineers used something even more audacious, interlocking stone cantilevers. By carefully shaping granite blocks to fit like puzzle pieces, they created self-supporting arches that extended outward in staggered layers. Each new layer compensated for the one before, distributing stress along the cliff face like a stone spiderweb. The result, towers that appeared to grow directly from the rock, their overhanging battlements offering defenders a deadly advantage, dropping stones or boiling oil straight onto attackers' heads without needing to lean perilously over the edge. Perhaps the most breathtaking examples hide in the monasteries of Meteora, Greece. Here, monks built entire chapels on rock pinnacles, with wooden galleries protruding over 600-foot drops. Their secret, a hybrid system of iron staples driven into the cliff and timber frameworks that flexed slightly in high winds, absorbing stress instead of resisting it. These weren't static structures, they danced with the wind, their slight movements preventing the catastrophic rigidity that could snap a tower like a dry twig. The true brilliance of these designs wasn't just their defiance of gravity, but their dialogue with it. Builders understood that balance wasn't about brute strength, it was about harmony. A well-cantilevered tower didn't fight the forces acting upon it. It redirected them, turning potential weaknesses into sources of stability. That's why so many of these structures still stand today, their overhanging stones frozen in mid-air, as if the architects left us one final message: see. Even the impossible bows to patience and craft. The fiercest opponents sometimes make the most surprising allies, and for medieval builders, the very elements that threatened their fortresses became secret weapons in disguise. Wind, often a relentless foe howling through cliffside gaps, was tamed into serving as a natural ventilation system. Architects at castles like Dunnottar in Scotland designed spiral staircases that acted as wind tunnels, drawing fresh air deep into the lower chambers while expelling dampness and smoke. Narrow slit windows weren't just for archers, they were precision engineered to create cross breezes, channeling gusts to sweep away stagnant air without letting storms intrude. Even the placement of towers played a role, with rounded faces deflecting harsh winds like a ship's prow cutting through waves. Water, too, shifted from adversary to accomplice. Instead of fighting the rain that battered their walls, builders funneled every drop into a lifeline. The fortress of Château-de-Baynac in France hid a network of carved gutters and clay pipes that directed rainfall into vast underground cisterns, some large enough to supply the garrison for months. In arid regions like Spain's Alhambra, engineers turned condensation into a resource, lining courtyard walls with porous gypsum that gathered nighttime dew, channeling it into delicate irrigation channels for gardens. And when winter came, they weaponized the cold. Ice clinging to outer walls added an extra layer of insulation, while frozen moats became impassable barriers. Even wildlife was recruited into the defense. Swallows nesting in cliffside crevices acted as early warning systems, their sudden silence hinting at approaching intruders. Bees kept in hollows within the walls not only provided honey but became living deterrents. Attackers who breached outer defenses might find themselves swarmed. At Dunnottar Castle, bats in the caverns below were tolerated for their role in controlling insects, while falcons nested in high towers, their presence discouraging messenger pigeons sent by besiegers. This wasn't just survival, it was symbiosis. By observing how nature solved problems, medieval architects pioneered concepts we now call sustainable design. Their rainwater systems predate modern greywater recycling by centuries. The passive cooling techniques in desert fortresses inspired today's energy-efficient buildings. And perhaps most remarkably, they achieved this not by conquering the landscape, but by listening to it, turning every whisper of wind, every trickle of water, into part of the fortress's voice. The lesson echoes down the ages. Sometimes the strongest defense isn't a barrier, but a partnership. A fortress perched on a cliff wasn't just a stronghold, it was a death trap waiting for invaders. When attackers came, they quickly learned that assaulting these vertigo-inducing bastions meant playing by nature's brutal rules. Take the siege of Masada in the 1st century, where Jewish rebels held off an entire Roman legion for months. The sheer cliffs forced the Romans into a grueling uphill slog, their siege towers rendered useless by the terrain. Instead, they built an enormous earthen ramp, a backbreaking project that took thousands of laborers just to reach the walls. Even then, the defenders rained down boulders and flaming arrows, turning the narrow approach into a slaughterhouse. The lesson was clear: against a well-designed cliffside fortress, even the mightiest army could be humbled by geography. But cliffs didn't just make approaches deadly, they transformed the fortress itself into a weapon. At Dunnottar Castle in Scotland, defenders during the 17th century siege didn't just drop rocks, they rolled entire barrels of pitch and tar down the cliffs, igniting them mid-fall to create fiery avalanches. The steep angles amplified the destruction, sending flames cascading into enemy ranks with terrifying precision. Meanwhile, the defenders of Mont Saint-Michel in the Pyrenees used the altitude to their advantage, hurling crossbow bolts with such force that they could pierce armor at twice the normal range. The thin air at that height also exhausted attackers unused to the altitude, leaving them gasping before they even reached the walls. Then there were the sieges where nature itself intervened. During the Ottoman assault on the Knights of Rhodes in 1522, a sudden storm smashed their fleet against the cliffs beneath the fortress, drowning hundreds. The defenders of Ponari Castle in Romania triggered landslides by sabotaging hidden drainage channels, burying entire battalions in mud and rock. These weren't just lucky breaks, they were calculated risks built into the very design of the fortresses. Architects had studied how water flowed, how rocks fractured, and how winds shifted, turning the landscape into a silent ally. The ultimate test came when starvation was the only weapon left. Cliffside fortresses like Carcassonne in France stored years' worth of supplies in caves carved into the rock, their cisterns fed by hidden springs. Attackers could wait for months, only to watch defenders lower baskets to harvest seabird eggs from inaccessible ledges or fish from vertiginous platforms. The siege of St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall lasted so long that the besiegers ran out of food before the garrison did a humiliation that reshaped military tactics for centuries. These battles proved something profound. The best fortresses didn't just resist nature's chaos, they harnessed it. Every falling rock, every howling gust, every crashing wave became part of the defense. The architects who built these strongholds understood something modern engineers still admire. True strength isn't about defying the elements, but bending them to your will. And when the dust settled, the cliffs remained silent witnesses to a war where stone and strategy outlasted steel. While armies could be repelled and sieges endured, no fortress could escape the slow, patient siege waged by nature itself. Erosion didn't charge the gates with battering rams, it crept in like a thief, wearing away stone grain by grain over decades, then centuries. Salt spray from crashing waves infiltrated mortar joints, crystallizing as it dried and expanding like 1,000 tiny wedges. In places like Tintagel Castle on Cornwall's storm-lashed coast, the sea air turned outer walls into crumbling skeletons, their surfaces pitted and flaking like sunburnt skin. Winter was even crueler. Water seeped into microscopic cracks, freezing into ice that expanded with irresistible force, fracturing solid rock as if it were glass. The fortress of Château-Gaillard in Normandy, once Richard the Lionheart's pride, slowly lost its battle with frost heave. Entire sections of its once imposing walls now lie scattered down the cliffs like fallen chess pieces. Yet medieval builders weren't helpless against this invisible onslaught. Their first line of defense, sacrificial stones, these specially placed blocks, often softer limestone or sandstone, were positioned to bear the brunt of erosion. Like a knight's shield taking blows meant for his body, these stones weathered away deliberately, their gradual loss sparing the critical load-bearing walls behind them. At Dover Castle, you can still see the clever asymmetry hard granite for inner cores, softer outer layers slowly retreating over time, like a turtle withdrawing into its shell. Then came the coatings, far from primitive. These were sophisticated recipes passed down through generations. Some mixed ox blood into lime plaster, creating a leathery membrane resistant to wind and rain. Others boiled pine resin with beeswax, painting it onto vulnerable surfaces to repel water like a medieval raincoat. The Moors of Andalusia went further, crafting glossy, alicatado tiles from quartz and clay that shed erosion like water off a duck's back. And let's not forget the humble but brilliant solution of sloping surfaces. Towers weren't just cylindrical for defense. Their curved shapes helped rain and snow slide off before penetrating the masonry. The real masterstroke, though, was maintenance. Unlike today's static ruins, these fortresses were living systems. Teams of wall walkers patrolled battlements after every storm, filling cracks with a mortar blend that included crushed seashells for extra resilience. At Carcassonne, records show they even replastered entire towers every 7 years, a medieval version of scheduled upkeep. This wasn't just repair, it was a dialogue with time itself, an acknowledgement that survival meant constant adaptation. Perhaps the most poetic resistance came from the plants builders initially fought. Ivy, once seen as a threat for rooting into cracks, was eventually encouraged in controlled patches, its roots stabilizing loose stone while its leaves diverted rainfall like living gutters. The cliffside monasteries of Meteora still showcase this balance, where centuries-old vines grip walls like nature's own reinforcement bars. In the end, these strategies reveal a profound truth. Medieval architects didn't just build for their own time. They built for futures they'd never see, crafting stone love letters to generations unborn. Every weathered surface we admire today is really a testament to their foresight, proof that durability isn't about defying nature's laws, but bending them to your will, one grain of sand at a time. Medieval builders didn't just pick cliffs at random, they played geological matchmakers, pairing their fortresses with rock formations that could endure centuries of abuse. Picture a master mason running his hands over a limestone outcrop, his fingers tracing hidden fault lines like a doctor checking a patient's pulse. He wasn't just looking for a pretty view, he was decoding the cliff's deepest secrets, searching for stones strong enough to carry the weight of history. The difference between success and catastrophe often came down to recognizing subtle clues, the way certain rocks fractured cleanly when struck, or how layers of sediment revealed ancient weaknesses. Take the towering basalt columns of Northern Ireland's Giant's Causeway. While its geometric perfection seems engineered by giants, medieval builders knew better. They saw how these interlocking pillars formed nature's perfect load-bearing structure. Castles like Dunluce exploited this natural architecture, their foundations slotting between the columns like keys in a lock. Contrast that with the tragic fate of Tintagel's early structures, built on slate that split like wet cardboard under its own weight. The builders who followed learned to listen when the rock whispered its warnings. Veins of soft shale running through granite signaled future collapse, while tightly packed sandstone could outlast dynasties. The real genius lay in spotting what wasn't there. Clever engineers studied erosion patterns like detectives at a crime scene. A concave curve in the cliff face hinted at underground water channels gnawing away at the stone. At Dunnottar Castle, they avoided porous limestone in favor of dense dolomite, recognizing how the latter resisted acidic rainwater that dissolved its weaker cousin. Some even conducted rudimentary stress tests, piling stones on potential building ledges and returning years later to see if the ground had settled. But the ultimate test came when human ingenuity met geological happenstance. The builders of Mont Saint-Michel struck gold when they discovered their tidal island's core wasn't just solid granite. It was granite laced with quartz veins, creating a natural reinforcement grid tougher than any man-made framework. Meanwhile, the cliffside monasteries of Meteora owed their longevity to a fluke of sedimentation. Their sandstone pedestals contained alternating hard and soft layers that eroded unevenly, forming self-stabilizing bases wider at the bottom than the top. This wasn't just construction, it was geological alchemy. By understanding that every cliff told a story written in mineral deposits and fossilized cracks, medieval architects turned landscapes into allies. Their greatest legacy isn't the stones they placed, but the ones they wisely left untouched. Rising from the swirling mists of Normandy's coast like a stone mirage, Mont Saint-Michel didn't just withstand the sea, it performed an intricate dance with it. Twice each day, the tides stage a relentless siege, swallowing the surrounding flats in a churning rush, only to retreat hours later as if conceding defeat. The medieval architects who built this island sanctuary didn't fight this rhythm. They turned it into their fortress's greatest defender, their first stroke of genius. Positioning the abbey atop a granite outcrop that had resisted the sea's teeth for millennia, this wasn't just a foundation, it was a geological shield, its dense crystalline structure shrugging off saltwater corrosion that would have crumbled softer stone within decades. But granite alone couldn't solve the tidal puzzle. The real challenge lay in the shifting sands left behind when the waters receded quicks and like traps that could swallow supply carts whole. The builders countered this by laying a submerged causeway of tightly packed rubble, its surface just porous enough to let water drain through but solid enough to prevent sinking. Modern engineers later discovered its secret. Alternating layers of crushed oyster shells and clay created a natural filtration system, stabilizing the path while allowing tidal flows to pass beneath. Even today, visitors crossing at low tide walk unknowingly atop 7 centuries of sediment-resistant innovation. Saltwater spray posed another invisible threat, creeping into mortar joints and rusting iron reinforcements like a slow-acting poison. Here, the monks turned to an unlikely ally, seaweed. By mixing burnt kelp ash into their lime plaster, they created a mortar that actually hardened when exposed to seawater, a medieval precursor to modern hydraulic cement. The abbey's sea-facing walls still bear this briny recipe, their surfaces pitted but uncracked after 800 years of Atlantic storms. Perhaps the most breathtaking adaptation lies in the abbey's water management. Every roof gutter, every courtyard drain, even the angles of the cloister's walkways were calculated to harness rainfall while deflecting storm surges. The famous Merveille, a 3-tiered masterpiece of medieval architecture, features hidden channels that divert cascading rainwater into cisterns, its sloped design minimizing wind resistance during gales. Meanwhile, the abbey's latrines empty directly into the tidal flush below, a sanitation system that required no manual cleaning, just the sea's punctual comings and goings. This harmony with nature's clock extended to defense. Attackers foolish enough to attempt a low-tide assault would find themselves outmaneuvered by the world's first timed battlefield. Local fishermen, hired as guides, knew exactly when the tide's mascarot, a sudden tidal bore, would transform sluggish streams into deadly rapids. Records tell of one failed English attack where knights in heavy armor drowned not in the open sea, but in what moments earlier had been ankle-deep streams. The abbey's sentries didn't just watch for enemies, they tracked the moon's phases like generals planning a campaign, knowing a spring tide could be more effective than 1,000 arrows. What makes Mont Saint-Michel truly extraordinary isn't just its resilience, but its willingness to bend. While other fortresses tried to dominate their landscapes, this tidal sentinel embraced flexibility, its walls absorbing the sea's fury like a reed in a storm, only to stand straighter when the waters retreated. The monks who built it left us a lesson etched in stone and salt. Sometimes survival isn't about standing firm against nature's forces, but learning to sway with them. Perched atop towering sandstone pillars that seem to erupt straight from the Thessalian plains, the monasteries of Meteora don't just overlook the Greek landscape, they defy it. These gravity-mocking sanctuaries, some balanced on rock spires thinner than a modern skyscraper, represent one of history's most audacious architectural gambles. Constructed between the 14th and 16th centuries by monks seeking solitude closer to heaven, every stone, every beam, every tile had to be hoisted hundreds of feet into the air with nothing more than ropes, pulleys, and sheer determination. The logistics would make even today's engineers pause. How do you transport an entire monastery's worth of materials when there's no path wider than a goat track and every gust of wind threatens to send supplies spiraling into the abyss? The answer lies in a system of baskets and nets so ingenious it borders on the surreal. Workers wove massive cargo nets from mountain vines, reinforced with leather straps, then suspended them from wooden winches mounted on temporary scaffolds. Each load, whether sacks of mortar or pre-carved marble columns, required perfect balance. An uneven distribution could send the entire net spinning, smashing its precious cargo against the rock face. Historical accounts describe the heart-stopping process. Monks would chant psalms as the creaking winches lifted materials inch by inch, their voices rising above the wind in a desperate prayer against snapped ropes. Some of these original hemp cables, preserved in monastery archives, show meticulous repairs where fibers had frayed under strain, silent witnesses to near disasters averted. But hauling materials was just the first hurdle. The real challenge came when builders had to work on ledges no wider than a dining table, where a single misstep meant certain death. Scaffolding wasn't just impractical, it was often impossible. Instead, workers dangled from ropes like spiders spinning a web, carving footholds directly into the sandstone as they descended. The monastery's walls grew slowly, layer by painstaking layer, with masons mixing mortar in small batches to prevent it from drying out mid-application. The Great Meteoron, the largest complex, took over 70 years to complete, not because of its size, but because construction could only proceed during calm weather windows between autumn storms and winter freezes. What's truly miraculous is how these structures endure. The sandstone pillars themselves are nature's paradox, soft enough to be shaped by hand tools yet strong under compression. Monks exploited this by carving the rock where it mattered most, creating keyholes and channels that anchored walls directly into the living stone, their secret weapon. A mortar recipe incorporating crushed local sandstone and beeswax, creating a bond that flexed slightly during earthquakes rather than shattering. The monastery's curved walls, often dismissed as aesthetic choices, actually serve as aerodynamic shields, dispersing wind forces that would topple straight-sided towers. Perhaps the most poignant survival tactic was the monks' acceptance of impermanence. Of the original 24 monasteries, only 6 remain, not due to collapse, but because the others were deliberately abandoned when maintenance became untenable. This wasn't failure, it was a profound understanding that some battles against nature can't be won, only postponed. The surviving monasteries still whisper this lesson in their every stone, a reminder that true resilience isn't about conquering the impossible, but finding the delicate balance where faith and physics shake hands. Jutting from Scotland's northeast coast like a stone fist clenched against the North Sea, Dunnottar Castle didn't just occupy its cliff, it became an extension of the cliff's will to survive. What makes this fortress extraordinary isn't just its dramatic setting, but how every turret, wall, and passageway whispers the same secret: adaptation is the ultimate defense. Unlike castles built on forgiving plains, Dunnottar's architects had to negotiate with gale force winds that could peel roofing lead like banana skins and winter storms that turned its courtyards into saltwater whirlpools. Their solution, a design that didn't resist the elements, but absorbed and redirected them like a martial artist using an opponent's momentum. Take the castle's infamous approach, a slender strip of land connecting the headland to the mainland, barely wider than 2 men abreast. At first glance, this seems like a vulnerability, but the builders recognized what modern engineers call choke point strategy. By forcing attackers to funnel onto this natural causeway, they turned the same winds that threatened the castle into invisible allies. Historical accounts describe English soldiers during the 17th century siege struggling just to stand upright. their formation breaking as gusts flung arrows back into their own ranks. Meanwhile, defenders sheltered behind curved walls that split the wind like ships' prows, their crossbow bolts flying true while invaders' shots veered wildly off course. But wind was just one adversary. The real genius lies in Dunnottar's water management, a system so sophisticated it put many modern buildings to shame. Rainwater, instead of eroding the cliffs, was captured by a network of gutters carved directly into the bedrock, channeled through stone conduits, and stored in cisterns lined with naturally waterproofing clay. During sieges, when poisonings were common, the castle's well drew from a freshwater spring hidden deep within the cliff's fissures, inaccessible to besiegers. Even the sea played its part. Tide submerged the only landing point for 8 hours a day, creating a natural drawbridge no enemy could dismantle. The castle's layout reveals even subtler adaptations. Unlike symmetrical fortresses designed for parade ground aesthetics, Dunnottar grew organically, its buildings huddling together like sheep in a storm. The thickest walls faced the prevailing winds, their surfaces slightly concave to disperse pressure, while leeward sides featured unexpected luxuries like large windows, architectural indulgences made possible by the natural windbreak of the cliff itself. Storerooms were dug into the rock rather than built atop it, maintaining stable temperatures for preserving food, while the chapel's orientation minimized salt spray damage to its delicate stained glass. Perhaps most impressively, Dunnottar's defenders weaponized the very thing that should have doomed them: isolation. When Cromwell's forces surrounded the castle in 1651, they expected a quick surrender. Instead, they watched helplessly as supply boats slipped past the blockade at night, guided by fishermen who knew every submerged reef and tidal current. The siege lasted 8 months, not because Dunnottar was impregnable, but because it was inseparable from its environment. Every crack in the cliff, every shift in the wind, every tidal schedule had been memorized and exploited by those who called it home. Today, as visitors trek up the vertiginous path to the ruins, they're walking through a masterclass in symbiotic design. The broken walls still teach their lesson. Durability isn't about brute strength, but about listening to the land, to the weather, to the whispers of stone and sea. Dunnottar's real victory wasn't surviving sieges. It was proving that the best defenses aren't imposed on nature, but woven into its fabric. For all their ingenuity, medieval builders occasionally met forces even their brilliance couldn't withstand. The ruins of Tintagel Castle on Cornwall's rugged coast tell one such cautionary tale, where the very cliff that gave it strategic advantage became its executioner. In the winter of 1280, a massive section of the headland simply collapsed into the sea, taking half the castle's kitchens and a defensive tower with it. Examination of the surviving foundations reveals why. Builders had unknowingly constructed over an ancient sea cave, its roof gradually thinning until one stormy night, the weight above proved too much. This wasn't poor craftsmanship, it was a geological trap invisible to even the most experienced masons, highlighting how medieval engineers sometimes gambled against nature with incomplete information. Earthquakes delivered even swifter justice. The once proud castle of Gibralfaro in southern Spain stood impregnable for centuries until the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755 sent seismic waves rippling across the continent. Its mighty walls, designed to deflect catapult stones, crumbled like dry bread when the ground itself began to dance. Modern geologists studying the rubble discovered the fatal flaw. The fortress had been built atop sedimentary layers that liquefied under vibration, a phenomenon unknown until the 20th century. Similar fates befell cliffside fortresses along the Anatolian coast, where entire battlements slid into the sea during tremors. their foundations resting on what archaeologists now identify as prehistoric landslide deposits. Perhaps the most relentless enemy proved to be rising sea levels. Dunwich Castle in England was once a bustling coastal stronghold. Now it lies 30 feet underwater, its location marked only by buoys warning ships of submerged ruins. Medieval chronicles describe desperate attempts to save it, including one ill-fated scheme to build a stone breakwater that only accelerated erosion by redirecting currents. Recent sonar scans reveal the heartbreaking detail. The castle's cellar stairs descend logically until suddenly twisting into nothingness, their lower steps erased by the hungry North Sea. These disasters weren't just tragedies, they were education written in stone and seawater. After Tintagel's collapse, builders began sounding cliffs with iron rods to detect hidden cavities. Following Gibraltar's earthquake damage, Spanish engineers started mixing horsehair into mortar for flexibility, creating early anti-seismic construction. And the slow-motion loss of Dunwich inspired a revolutionary concept: movable fortifications. The portable prefabricated castles used by Henry V in France owed their existence to watching static strongholds lose battles against shifting coastlines. What makes these failures as instructive as the successes is their honesty. They remind us that medieval engineering wasn't about omnipotence, it was about dialogue. Each collapse added new rules to the conversation between human ambition and earthly reality, written in a language of cracked mortar and tilted foundation stones. The ruins still whisper this lesson. True mastery lies not in never falling, but in learning why you fell. Without steel cables or hydraulic lifts, medieval builders faced a seemingly impossible task, hoisting multi-ton stone blocks up sheer cliff faces. Their solution, a combination of ingenuity and elbow grease that would make modern engineers blush. The humble windlass, a wooden drum turned by teams of laborers or oxen, became their primary lifting device. Ropes woven from hemp or horsehair, soaked in pine tar to prevent fraying, looped around these drums to raise materials inch by agonizing inch. But the real stroke of genius came with the squirrel cage crane, a massive human-powered treadmill where workers walked inside a wooden wheel like rodents in an exercise wheel, their collective weight transferring through gears to lift stones higher than 3 grown men standing on each other's shoulders. What truly set master builders apart wasn't just their tools, but their materials science. The mortar binding these precarious structures wasn't the uniform gray paste we know today. It was a carefully guarded alchemy. At Dover Castle, archaeologists found mortar mixed with crushed Roman tiles, giving it a pinkish hue and surprising resistance to salt water. Welsh builders added sheep's wool to their mix, creating a fibrous matrix that flexed slightly under stress rather than cracking. The most durable recipes came from volcanic regions, where builders harvested pozzolana ash that chemically reacted with seawater to form a concrete-like bond stronger than the stone itself. Transporting materials required equal creativity. In the Swiss Alps, builders slid stone blocks down snow-packed chutes in winter, letting gravity do the heavy lifting. Coastal sites like Dunnottar used the tides, floating stones ashore on rafts during high water, then winching them up before the sea retreated, the most startling adaptation. Living scaffolding, a builders trained ivy vines to grow in precise patterns up cliff faces, their thick stems forming natural ladders strong enough to support workers and materials. Precision work happened with shockingly simple tools. Masons used plumb bobs filled with mercury for perfect vertical lines, their liquid centers self-leveling even on windy cliffs. To check stone flatness, they employed truth planes, wooden frames strung with horsehair that revealed imperfections when placed across surfaces. Even their measuring systems were ingenious. Many castles show evidence of dimension stones, precisely sized blocks used as physical templates to ensure consistency across work crews. The true masterpiece was their problem-solving mindset. When the Knights Hospitaller needed to build St. John's Castle on Malta's crumbling cliffs, they couldn't find enough local timber for scaffolding. Their solution: they dismantled their own ship's masts, creating temporary supports while the mortar cured, then reassembled the vessels when the walls could stand alone. At Mont Saint-Michel, builders facing quicks and laid down a brushwood mattress, layers of intertwined branches that distributed weight like modern geotextiles. These weren't just construction techniques, they were acts of faith in human cleverness. Every rope burn, every calloused hand, every improvised solution whispers across the centuries that brilliance isn't about what tools you have, but how you see the world around you. The next time you marvel at a cliffside fortress, look closer. Those weathered stones hold more than history. They hold the fingerprints of ordinary people who refuse to accept the word impossible. When the first light of dawn struck the battlements of a cliffside fortress, it didn't just illuminate stone, it ignited a carefully crafted illusion of invincibility. These vertiginous strongholds played a dual role, serving as both shield and theater, where every crenellation and overhang whispered a calculated message to friend and foe alike. The silhouette of a fortress like Castel del Monte in Italy wasn't merely functional. Its octagonal towers framed against the sky transformed mathematics into intimidation, proving that geometry could be as fearsome as any army. Visitors approaching along winding paths would witness the castle morphing with perspective. One moment a delicate crown of stone, the next an impassable wall blocking the horizon. This wasn't accidental. It was architectural choreography designed to humble before a single arrow was loosed. Psychological warfare extended beyond mere height. Consider the strategic use of reflections. Polished shields mounted on Welsh battlements caught the setting sun, making entire fortresses appear ablaze from miles away. The Moors of Andalusia took this further, facing their towers with quartz-infused plaster that shimmered like mirages in the desert heat. Even color played its part. The deep red stones of Berg Eltz in Germany weren't just durable. Their rust-hued walls evoked dried blood, a subconscious warning to would-be attackers. Yet the most potent symbol wasn't man-made at all, it was the cliffs themselves. By building where no sensible person would dare, lords demonstrated a terrifying indifference to danger. When the Duke of Berry constructed his castle on the vertiginous Puylorens outcrop, he wasn't just securing a vantage point. He was staging a performance where the lead actor casually dangled his life over the abyss. Chroniclers wrote of visiting diplomats needing to crawl the final approach on hands and knees, not from fear of soldiers, but from sheer physiological terror at the drop beneath them. This symbiosis of survival and spectacle reached its zenith in the Crusader castles of the Levant. Crac des Chevaliers didn't just dominate its Syrian hilltop, it mirrored the landscape's harsh beauty, its concentric walls echoing the surrounding terraced slopes. The message was clear: we belong here as naturally as the bedrock itself. Meanwhile, the Teutonic Knights built their Marienburg castle with intentionally exaggerated proportions, doorways taller than necessary, staircases wider than required, forcing visitors to feel physically diminished before negotiations even began. The true genius lay in how these fortresses adapted their symbolism to local contexts. In Scotland's Dunnottar, the exposed sea cliffs spoke of Norse resilience against the elements. Portugal's Montserrat's castle, balanced precariously on its outcrop, became a chess piece in the Christian Reconquista. Even in decay, the symbolism endured. the broken arches of Normandy's Château-Gaillard didn't signal defeat so much as a defiant smile of jagged teeth against the sky. What modern visitors often miss is that these weren't static statements, they were ongoing conversations with the land. The annual ritual of replastering walls in ceremonial colors, the torchlit processions along vertiginous parapets, even the strategic planting of gnarled trees on approach paths all served to renew the fortress's psychological grip. A well-positioned stronghold could control a region for generations without firing a shot, its very shadow stretching across the valleys below like an unspoken threat written in stone and sky. The lesson resonates beyond medieval times. True power isn't just about strength, but about staging. These architects understood that survival required more than thick walls. It needed a story that seeped into the bones of friend and foe alike. When the wind howls through the empty halls of Ponari Castle today, it doesn't just carry echoes of the past, it carries the ghost of an idea that sometimes the best defense is making your enemy believe assault would be an act against nature itself. The men who built these vertiginous fortresses didn't just risk their lives, they signed contracts written in sweat and blood. Imagine clinging to a makeshift scaffold 200 feet above crashing waves, your fingers numb from cold as you chip away at unyielding rock. Historical records from Mont Saint-Michel's construction list 17 fatalities in a single year, not from battle, but from snapped ropes and sudden collapses. These weren't accidents, they were occupational hazards baked into every stone. A mason's contract from 15th century Wales survives, its cramped script detailing hazard pay for works above the void, triple wages for tasks where one misstep meant certain death. The physical toll defies modern comprehension. Workers developed permanent spinal deformities from hauling 60-pound stone blocks up narrow switchbacks, their bodies reshaped by the relentless uphill struggle. Medical excavations at Carcassonne revealed skeletons with grotesquely enlarged right shoulders, a lifetime of single-sided strain from lifting, and then there were the hands. Examination of tools from Dunnottar Castle shows handles worn smooth not by gloves, but by flesh rubbed raw until calluses formed natural armor. These men didn't just build with their hands, they rebuilt their very anatomy to meet the cliff's demands. Some dangers were silent killers. Stonemasons inhaling granite dust developed a condition called the lung rot, coughing up gravel like phlegm until they suffocated. Lead roofers absorbed poison through their skin, their minds slowly unraveling from the metal's grip. The worst fate awaited those mixing mortar. The caustic lime burned through leather gloves, eating flesh down to bone in painful ulcers that never fully healed. Yet the most heartbreaking sacrifices were often psychological. Seasonal workers spent years away from families, their children growing up strangers. The ballad of the Mason's Lament, passed down in Scottish oral tradition, tells of a man returning after a decade to find his village obliterated by plague, his name remembered only on a weathered grave marker. Other workers faced permanent disfigurement, crushed limbs, or blinded eyes, marking them as ruined men, unfit for further labor. What makes their struggle extraordinary isn't just the suffering, but the solidarity it forged. Payroll lists show crews pooling wages to support injured comrades. At Mont Saint-Michel, workers carved their names alongside saints in the abbey's hidden passages, not as vandals, but as men asserting their place in the story. The cliffside castles we admire today weren't built by faceless drones, but by individuals who left subtle marks everywhere. A thumbprint preserved in drying mortar here, a crude chessboard scratched into a quarry stone there. These weren't just construction sites, they were theaters of human resilience, where every stone laid represented a battle won against gravity, fatigue, and despair. The true cost of these architectural marvels can't be measured in silver or timber. but in the countless small tragedies and triumphs swallowed by history's silence. When we run our hands along those weathered walls today, we're not just touching stone, we're brushing against the ghosts of those who gave their bodies to defy the impossible. Before the first stone could be laid, medieval builders faced a paradox to create something permanent. They had to first construct the most temporary and treacherous element of all, the scaffolding. These skeletal wooden frameworks, now vanished from history like ghostly footprints, were the unsung heroes of cliffside construction. Unlike modern metal scaffolding anchored securely into place, these were dynamic, creaking structures that swayed with the wind and shifted under workers' feet. At Mont Saint-Michel, records describe scaffolds lashed together with willow branches flexible enough to absorb gusts but strong enough to bear tons of stone. The real marvel, they were built from the top down. Workers would first climb the bare cliff face using ropes and carved footholds, then lower pre-assembled platforms into position, creating a descending web of support that grew alongside the fortress walls. The design variations were as diverse as the landscapes they conquered. In the damp Scottish Highlands, builders used fresh-cut pine soaked in brine to resist rot, its resin acting as a natural glue between joints. Mediterranean crews favored lightweight poplar frames that could be disassembled and carried uphill in pieces. But the most daring systems appeared along Norway's fjords, where builders suspended entire work platforms from above using Viking-era rope techniques. The same knotwork that once secured longships in stormy seas, now keeping craftsmen from plunging into icy voids. What made these structures truly extraordinary was their improvisational nature. Surviving sketches from monastery ledgers show calculations scratched in margins, ratios of weight to rope thickness, angles of support beams, evidence of on-the-fly engineering. At Carcassonne, archaeologists found notches in the cliff face indicating where scaffolds had been anchored, revealing a pattern modern engineers recognize as early load distribution. The workers didn't just build upward, they built outward, creating cantilevered platforms that extended like tree branches over the abyss. Some even incorporated the growing fortress itself, using completed sections to anchor new supports in a reciprocal dance between temporary and permanent. The human cost of this high-wire act was etched into the records. A ledger from Cornwall's Tintagel Castle lists payments to widows whose husbands fell with the framing, while a Welsh bard's poem describes the eerie music of wind humming through abandoned scaffolds after construction. Yet these fragile frameworks enabled miracles, the delicate stone tracery of Meteora's monasteries, the gravity-defying overhangs of Portugal's Castle of the Moors, all crafted on platforms that would leave no trace beyond a few weathered peg holes in ancient stones. Perhaps the greatest testament to their ingenuity lies in what didn't happen. Despite the dizzying heights and primitive materials, catastrophic collapses were remarkably rare. Builders understood that strength came from flexibility. Their scaffolds swayed like reeds rather than resisting like oaks, redistributing stress through the entire network. When the last stones were set and the wood was finally dismantled, the scaffolds left behind something more than just fortresses. They left a silent lesson in how to touch the sky without losing your footing. While architects plotted designs and masons shaped stone, another workforce toiled in silence, hooves pounding, wings beating, and sturdy backs bending under impossible loads. Animals weren't just helpers in medieval cliffside construction. They were living machines, their instincts and strength filling gaps where human ability fell short. Picture a train of oxen, their massive shoulders straining against wooden yokes as they dragged sledges loaded with limestone blocks up switchback trails too narrow for carts. These patient beasts could move stones weighing as much as 2 grown elephants, their steady pace unshaken by winds that sent human workers crawling on their knees for balance. Records from Dover Castle show oxen working in rotating teams, 4 animals pulling while 8 rested, their shifts timed like a well-oiled factory centuries before the Industrial Revolution. But strength wasn't the only gift animals brought to the build. Donkeys, nimble and sure-footed as mountain goats, became the supply trucks of inaccessible sites. Their small hooves found purchase on crumbling ledges where no wagon could follow, their saddlebags stuffed with iron nails, tools, and even delicate stained glass packed in straw. At Mont Saint-Michel, donkeys carried barrels of fresh water from mainland springs, their routes timed to the tides one misstep, and both animal and precious cargo vanished into the quicksand. The true test of trust came when donkeys were fitted with special test loads, piles of stones deliberately balanced to mimic unstable building materials. If the donkey could navigate a path without stumbling, builders knew their supply route was secure. Then there were the feathered laborers' carrier pigeons, whose wings became the medieval equivalent of a construction site radio. When scaffolding collapsed at the Castle of the Moors, trapping workers on an isolated cliff face, it was pigeons that raced to fetch help, their tiny scroll tubes bearing urgent pleas for ropes and physicians. At Carcassonne, trained falcons kept seagulls from stealing mortar-binding horsehair, while geese penned near grain stores served as living alarm systems against thieves. Even dogs had their role. Mastiffs patrolled Scottish castles at night, not just to deter intruders, but to sniff out rotting timber in walls before it could fail. The most surprising collaborators, goats, before heavy machinery could test ground stability, herds were driven across building sites. If their hooves sank into the earth, engineers knew to dig deeper foundations. At Dunnottar, goats were released onto newly completed battlements if they could climb the walls, so could attackers, prompting hasty redesigns. Their grazing habits even shaped landscaping. The clear lines of sight around many fortresses exist because goats kept vegetation trimmed below arrow slit height for centuries. This partnership between human and animal wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Oxen that died hauling stones for cathedrals were sometimes buried beneath the walls they helped raise, their bones mingling with the foundations. Falconers at Crusader castles received wages equal to master masons, their birds' leather hoods embroidered with protective prayers. The deeper truth emerges in medieval sketches, margin doodles of donkeys wearing tiny crowns, or pigeons depicted as angels carrying stone blocks heavenward. These weren't just tools with fur and feathers, they were honored comrades in the great duel against gravity and time. Their silent contributions still echo in the mortar cracks and worn steps of every cliffside fortress, ghostly hoofbeats and wingbeats woven into the stone. The cliffs themselves were the first line of defense, but medieval builders didn't stop there. They turned these natural fortresses into multi-layered nightmares for any army foolish enough to attack. As siege tactics grew more sophisticated, so did the countermeasures, evolving from simple walls to intricate systems where every stone concealed a deadly surprise. Take the machicolation. Those ominous stone galleries jutting out from castle walls weren't just architectural flourishes. They were murder holes disguised as decoration, allowing defenders to rain down boiling oil, arrows, or even quicklime onto attackers below while remaining shielded from return fire. At Dunnottar Castle, the machicolations were angled so precisely that dropped stones would ricochet off the cliff face, creating deadly ricochets no shield could block. But death came from above and below. Many cliffside fortresses incorporated concealed sally ports, narrow tunnels carved straight through the living rock, emerging far beyond the main gates. These hidden passages let defenders launch guerrilla strikes, disappearing back into the mountain like ghosts. The Castle of the Moors in Portugal took this further with its false ruins tactic, deliberately collapsed sections of wall that funneled attackers into kill zones where archers had pre-measured every shot. Meanwhile, the cliff's own erosion worked as a silent ally. At Mont Saint-Michel, builders designed the approach path to flood predictably, stranding attackers on shrinking islands of safety as the tide rose. The real genius lay in how these features adapted to each site's unique geography. Where a landlocked castle might rely on deep moats, coastal strongholds like Tintagel used the sea itself as a liquid barrier, with submerged spikes to gut boats at high tide. In the Alps, the Hohenwürfen castle's hanging parapets were built with overhangs so extreme that snow avalanches would cascade harmlessly over them, while burying assault troops below. Even the staircases were weaponed spiral steps at Château de Baynac twisted clockwise, forcing right-handed attackers to expose their unshielded sides while climbing. Perhaps no innovation was more terrifying than the psychological traps. The cliffside monasteries of Meteora installed echo chambers beneath their gates, narrow shafts that amplified approaching footsteps into thunderous echoes, making small scouting parties sound like invading hordes. At Prajoma Castle, defenders would lower dummies dressed in armor off the cliffs at night, their clattering chains convincing besiegers the fortress was launching spectral warriors. This wasn't just defense, it was theater of war where every stone played a role. The lesson written in these walls is clear. Survival didn't belong to the strongest, but to those who could turn a cliff's every crevice into an opportunity and an enemy's every advance into a fatal miscalculation. Stone walls may seem impervious to flames, but the truth was far more terrifying for medieval builders. Fire didn't need to consume the fortress to destroy it. In those cramped cliffside spaces where every beam and storage barrel crowded against the next, a single spark could turn years of labor to ash. The real danger wasn't just the blaze itself, but what came after, the sudden collapse of wooden supports holding up tons of masonry, or the explosive shattering of overheated stone. At Château de Coucy in France, records tell of a kitchen fire that weakened ceiling joists, causing an entire tower to slump sideways like a drunkard all because a gust of wind blew embers into a thatched pantry roof. To outwit this invisible enemy, architects became masters of compartmentalization. Kitchens, the most obvious hazard, were often isolated in detached buildings or placed on windward sides where sparks would blow away from main structures. The cliffside monasteries of Meteora took this further, carving their kitchens directly into the rock with slate countertops and copper hoods to contain flames. Meanwhile, storerooms holding flammable goods like grain or oil were tucked into cool, damp cellars or in coastal forts like Dunnottar, hollowed out of seaside caves where the salt air naturally suppressed combustion. Roofing choices became life or death decisions. Thatched roofs, common in villages below, were unthinkable at these heights. Instead, builders layered slate tiles like dragon scales, overlapping them with gaps to dissipate heat. Excavations at Mont Saint-Michel reveal an even cleverer trick. Beneath the visible slate, workers packed a layer of crushed seashells mixed with clay, creating a firebreak that starved flames of oxygen. For timber too vital to replace, like the great hall beams at Conwy Castle, builders soaked the wood in brine before installation, giving it a protective crust of crystallized salt that resisted ignition. The real genius lay in passive defenses most visitors never noticed. Arrow slits doubled as ventilation shafts to prevent heat buildup, while spiral staircases acted as natural chimneys, channeling smoke upward instead of letting it pool. At Carcassonne, masons embedded iron rods within walls, not for structural support, but to conduct heat away from vulnerable wooden lintels. Even the castle's famous double walls served a firefighting purpose. The gap between them created a dead air space that slowed flame spread, buying critical time for defenders to douse blazes with vinegar-soaked sand water being too precious to waste. Perhaps the most haunting lesson came from disasters themselves. After a catastrophic fire at Castle Stalker in Scotland, where flaming tallow candles ignited tapestries, builders began mounting candle holders on rotating stone arms that could be swung outside window openings at night. The ruins of Ponari Castle in Romania show grooves carved into floor joists not for decoration, but to hold iron pans filled with water, creating emergency fire breaks between levels. Every tragedy etched new wisdom into stone, a grim dialogue between human ambition and an element that refused to be tamed. In the end, these adaptations reveal a truth as enduring as the cliffs themselves. The greatest threat to a fortress wasn't the siege engines outside its walls, but the quiet dangers within. The architects who mastered fire didn't conquer it, they learned its language, designing spaces that whispered warnings in the creak of overheated beams and the snap of cooling stone. Their legacy survives not in grand proclamations, but in the absence of scars, in the countless fires that never were, stopped by foresight as much as by flame. Standing at the base of a cliffside fortress, an invading soldier didn't just see walls. He faced a gauntlet of psychological traps designed to unravel his courage before the first arrow flew. The sheer verticality of these strongholds weaponized human instinct itself. That dizzying drop wasn't merely a physical barrier, it triggered primal vertigo, turning sturdy warriors into trembling novices as their bodies rebelled against the void. Historical accounts from the siege of Mont Saint-Michel describe seasoned knights crawling on hands and knees along cliffside paths, their armor suddenly feeling like a death sentence as the wind tugged at their balance. Defenders amplified this terror with simple tricks, painting parapets in optical illusion patterns that made depths appear bottomless, or hanging frayed ropes from battlements to suggest previous climbers had fallen. Then came the staircases, those deceptively narrow spirals that forced attackers into single file, stripping away the safety of numbers. The Crusader Castle of Crac des Chevaliers perfected this with steps of uneven heights, disrupting rhythmic climbing and exhausting assault troops as they stumbled upward. At Dunnottar, builders added a cruel twist. Right-handed soldiers, the vast majority, found their sword arms pinned against the central pillar, while defenders above rained blows on their exposed left sides. Even the act of climbing became demoralizing. Many stairwells were deliberately unlit, leaving invaders to feel their way through darkness as debris rained down from murder holes above. But the true mastery lay in how these fortresses exploited the landscape's natural theatrics. The echoing acoustics of cliff faces turned defenders' shouts into ghostly chorus, making a handful of men sound like an army. At Portugal's Castle of the Moors, commanders staged eerie torchlight processions along remote ridges at night, creating the illusion of reinforcements arriving from impossible directions. Some garrisons even harnessed wildlife, training falcons to drop screeching pebbles onto attackers' helmets, or releasing swarms of bats at dusk to disorient besiegers. The most brilliant psychological strikes were often the subtlest. Defenders at Château de Baynac would lower baskets of fresh bread and wine to starving attackers, not from mercy, but to showcase their abundant supplies. The message was clear: you'll die here long before we do. Other fortresses incorporated suicide doors, seemingly vulnerable entry points that actually led to dead-end courtyards where invaders could be slaughtered at leisure. Every element whispered the same truth. In this duel between human and horizon, the cliff had already chosen its champion. These mind games left their mark beyond medieval times. Modern special forces still train on replica cliffside fortifications, proving that while weapons evolve, the fear of falling never does. The real victory wasn't just in keeping enemies out, it was in making them too unnerved to try. Abandoned fortresses stand as eerie monuments to nature's relentless patience. Where once the clang of hammers and shouts of laborers filled the air, now only the whisper of wind through crumbling arches remains. Ivy slithers up fractured walls like a slow-moving conqueror, its roots prying apart stones that once defied armies. In places like North Wales' Duel Castle, entire towers lie half-swallowed by creeping moss, their outlines blurred under a green shroud. This isn't destruction, it's transformation, as nature rewrites human ambition in the language of lichen and weathering. The process unfolds with almost surgical precision. Water, the quietest saboteur, seeps into microscopic cracks during winter freezes, expanding with enough force to split granite over decades. At Scotland's Kilchurn Castle, mornings reveal fresh scars where overnight frost has flaked away another layer of history. Meanwhile, birds nesting in crevices dislodge mortar with each season's nest building, their tiny beaks accomplishing what battering rams failed to do centuries prior. Even the air plays its part. Salt-laden coastal winds at Ireland's Dunnottar Castle have sculpted softer stones into surreal honeycomb patterns, turning fortifications into fragile lacework. Yet the most dramatic reclamations happen underground. Tree roots, drawn irresistibly to the moisture trapped in ancient mortar, snake through forgotten cellars and stairwells. In Portugal's Castle of the Moors, a massive oak now grows where knights once dined, its trunk bursting through the floor of the great hall like a living column. These botanical invaders don't just occupy space, they reshape it. Archaeologists at France's Château de la Roche-Guyon discovered that a single sycamore's root system had lifted an entire section of curtain wall 2 inches off its foundation, proving nature's leverage against human engineering. The irony is palpable where defensive strategies backfire. Those ingenious cliffside positions that made fortresses impregnable now accelerate their demise. Erosion undercuts foundations at Tintagel, sending sections of wall sliding into the sea with each passing storm. The same ocean views that once spotted enemy ships now invite salt spray to gnaw at the remaining stones. Even the builder's own materials sometimes betray them. Iron reinforcements inserted for strength rust and expand over centuries, splitting surrounding masonry from within like time bombs. But there's a haunting beauty in this surrender. Sunlight filters differently through broken vaults than it did through arrow slits, painting shifting mosaics on mossy floors. Bats roost where sentries once stood watch, their ultrasonic clicks echoing through corridors that haven't heard human voices in generations. At twilight, when shadows stretch across the tumbled stones of Cyprus' Dunnottar Castle, the boundary between architecture and landscape dissolves completely, just as the builders themselves have returned to the earth that now reclaims their creations. These ruins whisper an unexpected lesson about permanence. The same forces dismantling these fortresses also preserve their memory, wrapping them in a protective cocoon of vines and weathering that shelters them from modern vandalism and neglect. A perfectly maintained castle tells only one story, its glory days, while a ruin tells thousands, each crack and collapse marking a conversation between human will and planetary time. The ivy-cracking Ponare Castle's walls is the same species that shielded its stones from artillery centuries ago, a reminder that nature isn't just the opponent in this duel, it's also the final caretaker, patiently erasing and preserving in the same breath. Modern architects gazing up at medieval cliffside fortresses aren't just admiring ancient handiwork, they're studying a masterclass in what to emulate and what to avoid. Today's cliff-hugging structures, from Norwegian fjord cabins to Californian tech billionaires' glass-walled retreats, walk a tightrope between medieval ingenuity and modern science. The biggest lesson learned: respect the cliff's voice. Where medieval builders sometimes forced their will upon the landscape, like at ill-fated Tintagel, contemporary architects begin with geological courtship. Laser scans now map every fissure before construction, while AI models simulate centuries of erosion in minutes, revealing which outcrops will remain steadfast and which are ticking time bombs. Take the Amangiri Resort in Utah, where cantilevered suites float above the desert like futuristic cliff castles. Its architects didn't just borrow the medieval concept of gravity-defying overhangs, they perfected it with carbon fiber tendons hidden within sandstone-clad walls, creating the illusion of impossibility without the risk. Similarly, Japan's Onsen Observatory uses the same principles of narrow approach paths that made castles like Dunnottar impregnable, but replaces crumbling stone stairs with earthquake-resistant titanium walkways that sway with seismic waves rather than resisting them. The real evolution lies in material alchemy. Modern builders still harness local stone for aesthetics, but behind those traditional facades lurk space-age composites. At Norway's Juvit Landscape Hotel, glass walls appear to hover between ancient pines, their structural strength coming from a medieval-inspired trick layers of adhesive borrowed from gecko foot biology, allowing full transparency without bulky frames. This marriage of old and new reaches its zenith in Greece's Santorini cliff villas, where builders mix volcanic ash into concrete just as their ancestors did, but now with polymers that self-heal cracks when exposed to seawater spray. Yet some medieval errors still haunt us. The recent collapse of a luxury Malibu home into the Pacific echoes the fate of Dunwich Castle, both victims of underestimating coastal erosion. The difference: today's failures spark immediate innovation. After the Malibu disaster, California now requires geological autopsies, core samples drilled deep below foundations to read the cliff's history like tree rings. Meanwhile, Scotland's new Highland observatories float on hydraulic legs that adjust to shifting bedrock, a high-tech answer to the settling that cracked so many medieval towers. The most profound shift isn't in tools but philosophy. Where medieval lords built to dominate landscapes, today's architects design to converse with them. Iceland's Harpa Concert Hall mirrors Dunnottar's use of basalt columns, but its honeycombed facade actually harvests wind energy from those punishing North Atlantic gales. Portugal's Arauca Bridge doesn't just span a gorge. Its walkway glass panels contain embedded moss that thrives on mountain mist, creating living railings that would make the castle of the Moors gardeners weep with envy. This isn't progress replacing tradition, it's the two finally speaking the same language. The next time you see a modern structure clinging to some impossible precipice, look closer. Those sleek lines hold ancient whispers, the curve of a Norman arch reborn in carbon fiber, the ghost of a matriculation smiling behind recessed lighting, the eternal dance between human ambition and geological reality continuing its measured steps into the future. Cliffside fortresses didn't just vanish into history, they leapt from crumbling stone into the realm of myth, becoming backdrops for dragons, dark lords, and doomed romance. Think of the Eyrie from Game of Thrones, its moon door yawning over an abyss that turns traitors into crimson stains on the rocks below. George R.R. Martin didn't pluck that image from thin air. He borrowed from the real-life terror of castles like Portugal's Monsanto, where defenders once rolled boulders onto attackers with similarly gruesome efficiency. Fantasy worlds adore these vertiginous strongholds because they embody contradiction. Invincible yet precarious, majestic yet lonely. When Peter Jackson needed a visual shorthand for Gondor's fading glory in Lord of the Rings, he perched Minas Tirith on a mountain's edge, its white walls echoing the limestone cliffs of Mont Saint-Michel, but stretched to impossible heights. The message was clear: this is a civilization clinging to the edge, both literally and metaphorically. Video games, too, have turned cliffside architecture into playgrounds of tension. The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim's High Hrothgar Monastery, reachable only by a treacherous path carved into the throat of the world, isn't just a scenic set piece. It forces players to slow down, feel the altitude in their guts, and earn their ascent. Meanwhile, Assassin's Creed games recreate real fortresses like Syria's Crack des Chevaliers with painstaking accuracy, letting players scramble up walls that medieval builders once scaled with ropes and prayers. These digital recreations tap into something primal, the thrill of conquering heights that once meant life or death. But why do these structures resonate so deeply in modern storytelling? Partly, it's their duality. A cliffside fortress is both shield and prison, offering safety at the cost of isolation. In Howl's Moving Castle, Diana Wynne Jones's wizard hero drags his castle up a mountain to escape war, only to find the altitude brings its own dangers: thin air, avalanches, and the creeping realization that no vantage point is high enough to outrun chaos. Similarly, the Princess Bride's cliffs of insanity aren't just obstacles, they're tests of endurance and cleverness where the climb itself reveals character. Even horror seizes on their eerie potential. The Netflix series The Witcher transforms Kaer Morhen into a brooding, half-ruined relic where wind howls through empty halls, a far cry from its book counterpart, but visually echoing real ruins like Dunnottar, where crumbling walls amplify every whisper into ghostly echoes. There's a reason vampires in folklore favor clifftop castles. The drop below mirrors the precipice between life and death, and the winding staircases become labyrinths where prey can't flee. The most fascinating adaptations, though, are the ones that subvert expectations. Disney's Tangled turns the traditional tower prison into a sunlit haven, proving even the most claustrophobic perches can become homes. And in Shadow of the Colossus, the lone fortress on the sea cliff isn't a symbol of power, but of sorrow, its empty corridors a monument to loss. These stories remind us that cliffside fortresses aren't just relics of war, they're canvases for human emotion, their stones absorbing as many dramas as sieges. Perhaps their enduring appeal lies in what they ask of us. To imagine scaling them is to confront our own limits: the fear of falling, the ache of the climb, the bittersweet triumph of reaching the top, only to realize how far there is to fall. Every fictional fortress carries traces of real ones: the grit of masons who worked without harnesses, the terror of soldiers guarding narrow passes, the quiet of monks who chose the sky as their cloister. When we dream up castles in the clouds today, we're not just escaping reality, we're reaching back through time to touch the same stones that once defied gravity and gravity's master, time itself. The duel between architects and nature was never truly a battle to be won. It was an eternal conversation, a give and take etched in stone and wind. These cliffside fortresses aren't just relics of human ambition, they're living lessons in humility and ingenuity. Look closely at their weathered walls, and you'll see the fingerprints of compromise where a tower leans slightly to accommodate a stubborn rock formation, or where a staircase twists unexpectedly to avoid an unstable fissure. The builders who raised these marvels understood something profound. True mastery isn't about domination, but about listening. They knew when to carve into the cliff and when to let the cliff carve their plans. Consider the quiet wisdom in what didn't happen. There are no fortresses atop certain cliffs, not because builders lacked courage, but because they recognized nature's unspoken no. The abandoned foundations at Cornwall's Bossigran Ridge tell that story, a half-finished wall swallowed by bracken, where some long-forgotten mason finally shrugged and stepped back. Yet even in surrender there was progress. Every collapsed attempt taught the next generation where not to build, how not to fight. The real victory wasn't in the structures that survived, but in the knowledge earned through both triumph and failure. What endures today is more than architecture, it's a philosophy. Modern engineers studying Mont Saint-Michel's tidal resilience or Meteora's seismic stability aren't just analyzing medieval techniques, they're decoding a mindset. These ancient builders worked with forces we now quantify with satellites and sensors, yet arrived at similar conclusions through observation and patience. Their legacy whispers to us across the centuries. Innovation isn't just about inventing new solutions, but about rediscovering old harmonies. So the next time you stand beneath a cliffside fortress, don't just marvel at its height. Look for the dialogue, the way the stones curve to meet the wind rather than block it, how the walls taper where the rock weakens. These aren't compromises, they're collaborations. And if you've felt the pull of these gravity-defying wonders, share your favorite in the comments. Is it the tidal mastery of Mont Saint-Michel or the sky-piercing drama of Meteora? Whatever stirs your imagination, remember to subscribe for more journeys where human history collides with nature's timeless stage. The horizon always has another story waiting.